Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 80, Game of Drones. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. Welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we're talking about the story told in the movie Oblivion. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing quite well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. And what's new in your writing world? Have you gotten through Zara 2 yet?
Yes and no. I did a full pass on the story. I don't remember if I mentioned that last week. I think I was there by then. But now I have to go through and, well, I don't have to. I'm in the middle of going through addressing sort of broader issues that ripple through the story. So that's still in progress. There are a lot of notes from the alpha read. And then I also had a discussion with my alpha readers, which I recorded. And then so I went back through that discussion and realized there was a lot more. There are a lot more things that said than were necessarily written up in their notes. So I had to add a lot of stuff to my edit list. So no, I'm not fully done with it yet. I have done one pass, but there's still a fair amount. I want to get it in as good a shape as I can before, throwing it out to beta and, copy editor. At some point in the middle of this, I'll probably say, this is good enough to put on Kindle Vella, where the story feels like it's fully consistent and mostly there. So I'll probably put it up on Kindle Vella before I've finished my edits to where I'm fully happy with it, just because it's like I want to get the story out for people to read who've been waiting for it on that platform. If someone wants to read an earlier version of the story, they can go there. There won't be too much that changes. I mean, it'll be massaging, adding some texture and detail, character emotions, things like that. But the broad story will be there. Anyway, that's where I'm at. How's it going?
Right at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, it's getting there for sure.
Okay. I am up to 22% on Meridian, just keeping typing.
Very good.
And as a reminder to our listeners, you can read Meridian, which is part of the Adventures of the Empyrean Guard, and it's available as it's being written on Patreon at the Galactic Hero level. And you can read Mike's first book in the Tales of Zara, which is The Golden Scarab of Balihar. That's available in episodic format on Kindle Vella, soon to be joined by The Wrath of Sekhmet on Kindle Vella, hopefully in the next few weeks. And you can also read the first book as an ebook or in paperback, and all those links are in the show notes. So what interesting stories have you come across lately in books, movies, or television?
Let's see. Not too much on the movie and TV front. I did finish Dan Brown's Origin, the novel. Yeah. That's his latest novel that he did, which is kind of sci-fi. Well, yeah, I guess I would say it's science fiction, which is sort of unusual for his stories, but it's like really near science fiction. Like it was written, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe, about like kind of where we're going in terms of technology and our understanding of things, AI and stuff like that. So it feels very topical today, and it extends out maybe, I don't know, 5 years. After that, I think the story will feel dated because we'll have gone past that prediction point. But it's pretty cool. It's a good story. I really like Dan Brown's writing. I feel it's probably a little bit longer than it needed to be. There's a cool idea in there. He has a good way of keeping tension and doing interesting reveals in his stories. I do feel like it, yeah, I feel like it's probably just a little bit long for where it went, because it drags out like the central sort of mystery of what was happening until pretty much the end. But overall, I liked it. Other than that, I think that's the only thing that I really caught on this over the last week. Yeah. How about you? Have you hit any cool stories?
Not much. I am reading the novel that we're going to be talking about next week. I'm continuing to read the Timothy Zahn Star Wars series.
Oh, cool.
That I was inspired to start reading after we read The Green and the Gray for this podcast. So I'm on book 2 now of that series. And it's an enjoyable read. Timothy Zahn's a good writer, and of course it's fun to be in the Star Wars universe. And so it's been a fun series to read. So I'm enjoying that. And again, I'm on the second book. I think that's a 3-part series.
Yeah.
Though I think there's more that I haven't read related specifically to Grand Admiral Thrawn. So I probably would like to maybe get a hold of some of those books and read those too after I finish this.
Yeah, he wrote a number of other books in the so-called Legends series, or Legends. I don't know, series is a pantheon of books. He wrote some about Thrawn, some about stormtroopers, and he had a mix of different stories. And then after the new movies came out, he did another set of books on Thrawn that are sort of more in the movie canon now.
Ah, yeah.
So, yeah, you have to see which way you want to go with that.
All right, I'll take a look at that, definitely.
Yeah.
Are you ready to talk about Oblivion?
Sure, let's go.
Today we're talking about the story told in the 2013 movie Oblivion, and I'm going to read the synopsis that comes up when you type Oblivion into Google. In the year 2077, Jack Harper works as a security repairman on an Earth left empty and devastated after a war with aliens. Jack has 2 weeks left before his mission ends, and he joins his fellow survivors on a faraway colony. However, Jack's concept of reality comes crashing down after he rescues a beautiful stranger from a downed spacecraft. The woman's arrival triggers a chain of events that culminates in Jack's nearly single-handed battle to save mankind. Did you like this movie?
Yeah, this is an interesting movie. I saw it when it first came out. I saw it in the theater, and I remember liking it. And I remember thinking, this is a good movie. It wasn't like a mind-blowing, completely awesome movie, but I enjoyed it. And watching it again, I kind of had the same feeling. I felt it held up pretty well. It's got an interesting story. I do think there's some things that could be improved, which we'll discuss later. But yeah, overall, I liked it. I think it does a good job of getting us into the story pretty quickly. We get a quick setup of the state of the world without really dwelling on it, with sort of this voiceover narration of, here's where we are, and then the story starts. So it gets us going pretty quick, gets us up to speed, and then it has some good setups for the characters that give you a sense of something not being right and the setup for the world not being as expected, right? Like you said in your description, we're just here for 2 more weeks and then we're going to be off-world. We've seen enough movies and we know that wasn't going to happen. Right? So it's like you already kind of prepped for just the fact that they say that tells you, okay, something's going to go wrong here, because that's how it goes. And then we see that he's having memories of a previous time, obviously from his previous life or before his memories were wiped. So we know that's going to come into play later. So they get into that pretty quick. You see those scenes fairly early on in the story. And overall, I like the twists and the reveals that they do throughout the story. I think it's an interesting sci-fi setup, and I like where they go with it. Yeah, I wasn't sure how I was going to find this movie going into it again, because I hadn't seen it in so long, but I found it very rewatchable. I was engaged with it. I think they do some yeah, they do some interesting foreshadowing, and it pays off. And they do some interesting character reveals. Yeah, overall, I liked it. I actually have more to say, I think, in the improved section because that's more interesting to me to talk about for this movie, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. But first, tell me what you liked about this movie.
I agree. Actually, I had very similar notes. I thought the setup of the story was great. I really loved the immersion into the world we got. It was very detailed and relatable, and you could really imagine yourself in this world. And I really appreciated that. And I think that's kind of what we've talked about this before. That's a world building element that when you're talking about a visual medium, most of that world building comes visually. I mean, we got a lot, like you said, the prologue with the backstory, that was all verbal. We could hear that. But the visual elements and all the details that were incorporated into that, I think were very well done too. So that it was, like I said, very immediately immersive and engaging pretty much from the start. And I really appreciated that. I thought it was a very watchable story, an enjoyable story. It was interesting, and there was some good mysteries that we got really nice breadcrumbs for the mysteries and weren't left hanging for too long until we got the next breadcrumb to ask new questions and to try to figure out what was going on. So yeah, I thought it was a really enjoyable movie. It was a movie that I would call, this was a plot-driven movie as opposed to, in my opinion, a character-driven movie. I didn't see much in the way of character movement. The plot was what moved things forward, but it was well done, and I thought it was enjoyable. It was a very entertaining story, and I liked it. But I agree, there's a few things that I might change. Even as a plot-driven story, I would change a few things. But nonetheless, I thought it was a fun watch, a good watch. I would watch it again.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. It's definitely a plot-driven movie. It's more cerebral in that sense, right? It's more about the idea and the mystery and the science fiction aspects and the reveals. And like you said, the world building is really cool. I think the story layout, the plot layout was very good. And maybe that leads us into what we would improve, unless you have more to say on that.
No, not at all. Let's move on. What would you improve?
Yeah. So for me, I was trying to think about it at the end, like, because there was something I felt was lacking. Like I wanted something more from it at the end. And I remember kind of feeling the same way the first time I saw it. It's like, it's a cool movie. It's close to being a great movie, but for me, it didn't quite get there. And I was trying to figure out why. And I think for me, sort of the overall thing was emotion. And I think part of that maybe is the direction and acting choices, but some of it is certainly in the writing and in the story. For example, when Jack realizes he's actually working on behalf of the invaders, I wanted that to hit him hard. Like that should have been a horrible realization for him. We should have seen angst or anger or disgust, something, and at least a couple of lines of dialogue showing how horrified and mad he was to have been put in that position. And when it happens, it's like, okay, I guess this is the new state of affairs. Like, there wasn't a lot of emotional reaction. We did get some, but it was like I think throughout the movie, a lot of the places where you would expect emotion, there was a very muted reaction. Okay, so let me think if I can think of another example for this. Oh, the very end, right? When the climactic moment, when Jack makes his sacrifice. I felt like, man, that should have been like this emotional moment. If I compare it to the climax of Armageddon, which is a completely silly and ridiculous movie, but super fun and actually very emotional, especially at that moment when Bruce Willis has to do his sacrifice. It's so much better in Armageddon. It's like, man, I'm like tearing up over this ridiculous scenario. And here it was like, okay, he sacrificed himself, like intellectually, I acknowledge that as like, wow, he did this great thing, but I don't get the feels. And I think that was a missed opportunity there. In the other example I mentioned, and one or two other points, certainly where there's the reveals, there should be like more of a reaction to it. I feel like it's an interesting science fiction story and laid out well in terms of reveals, but I want to see the emotionality increased and those reveals pumped up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then there's a couple of other things where, and this is kind of maybe a little silly, but it's something we've touched on before about the ending and seeing characters in the new life, right? And the new state of the world. We got that to some extent, but I kind of wanted to see what happened with the 1,000 other Jack and Victorias that were scattered over the earth,
Yes.
right? Like there's a whole world going on, as well as what I was assume would be other pockets of resistance on the planet. And that made me think like, yeah, we didn't get that throughout the story. Given I understand that they're trying to make this, sort of personal story with him and what he's going through and Victoria and his wife. But given the epic scale of what happened, the moon being destroyed and the planet being taken over and destroyed, I wanted to see, they could have at least had them communicating with other pockets of civilization, even if it was just in the United States and not around the world, just to show us some of that larger scope of what was happening and give us a taste for that epic sense. Because I feel like we lost that in this. And this is where I feel like, since we just saw Independence Day recently and discussed that, I feel like Independence Day did those things better, right? It showed cities around the world being destroyed. And then at the end, people around the world were cheering everywhere. It's like, I feel like I wanted some of that. Maybe a bit of this reaction of mine is bleed over from that movie. But I do feel like watching this now, even on its own, I feel like I missed some of that epicness that it could have had. Probably because of their attempt to make it more personal. I think you could have done both.
Yeah.
Independence Day did both. I don't see any reason why they couldn't have done that here. Just a few little things that I suggested, right? Just have us hear about the discussions, and then at the end we see some of those other areas of civilization, of people fighting back. Even if it's just hearing from around the world, we're free, we're something, right? Give us some of that larger scope. And then also I wanted to see a bit more of a connection between him and his wife. Emotion between them. Again, it was kind of like cerebral. There's like, oh, you're my wife. Okay, I remember that. And then we get the little moment where they're on the Empire State Building, I guess. It's like it's there, but it's like for some reason the emotionality didn't ring through. I would have wanted to see a little bit more time, a little bit more. Maybe it's a direction issue for some of those scenes, because there was some stuff that was there. It didn't pull me in as much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think maybe some dialogue would have helped push the reaction a little bit more. Have him react in particular. Have her be like, wait, how much time has passed? What's going on? You're not, there's not just one of you. There was like no dialogue reaction to that, really. They just kind of like, they had these glances and then moved on after the reveals. And I think you could have had all those moments pumped up a little bit more. And I think for me, that would have elevated the overall feel of this movie a lot. I don't know. What do you think of what I said, and what would you improve?
I think you raise an excellent point. I too was missing that connection, but did not identify it in that way until you said that. And you're absolutely correct. And I kind of assumed as I was watching that part of his sort of muted responses was part of the cloning, right? At one point, the Morgan Freeman character, Malcolm, says something about, I saw a spark in you, you were different, you were curious, which suggested that there was sort of a suppression of personality in the cloning process. But that explanation only goes so far.
Yes.
And it doesn't explain, as you pointed out, Julia's lack of response when she returns and her husband seems to be married to somebody else. And you're correct. There was this really muted response. As a matter of fact, the only really strong response we got was from the humans who they thought were scabs. The Morgan Freeman character, Sergeant Sykes. Those folks were deeply passionate.
Yeah.
In their reactions. So, yeah, I think you raise a really good point. And I agree. I think that would have raised the heart in the story quite significantly. I think the biggest issues that I had with the story, and while it was a very engaging and fun story. We go back to the thing where you have setups and you have payoffs, and we had setups in the story that were not paid off, and you can do that even in a plot-driven story. You can still have your payoffs, your setups paid off, and that didn't really happen here. There was a lot of unanswered questions at the end of this movie, like you just pointed out. What about the rest of the Jacks and the Vikas? Where did they? What's going on with them? And not that I think I needed to know, but I think it would have been nice to just acknowledge the fact that the originals were probably killed. Right. And that there needed to be some acknowledgement of that. They weren't just in that aquarium full of clones. I think there also needed to be some acknowledgement of a little bit more details about what the Tet was trying to accomplish. I mean, yes, we got, okay, they go from world to world and suck the resources dry. This was apparently something that was completely automated. There was no life forms involved. They didn't need these resources, so it was just the mechanicals using the resources. There was something about it that didn't make sense, that I think a little bit more information would have been helpful. So it was things like that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because that was something I thought about too. And now that you mention it, it really brings it to the forefront of my mind. They had these things that were, from Jack's perspective, I guess, power stations or something. I think that's what they said.
Yeah, they were converting seawater into power, I guess, that they were then sucking away. They were going to suck the planet dry of seawater using this conversion.
And yeah, but then you're right. Like, and then what?
Right.
What does that mean? And what are the aliens? It's kind of interesting. Is it like, because it could just be like artificial intelligence has set these things up, right? Has set this process in motion to go from planet to planet to planet to bring energy back for them for some reason. Or it could be aliens doing this, the organic aliens. We never really know. I guess that wasn't necessarily critical, but you're right. I did kind of want to know a little bit more about that, especially the energy generation things. I didn't really get that aspect of it.
I mean, because if it's just these mechanicals, it would have been much more efficient just to get energy from solar energy.
Right.
So, but I like your idea about taking it back to like maybe a world where the sun has died. That would have added a really neat layer to it. But anyway, so it was just little things like that. The other thing that kind of stood out for me was that some of the behavior didn't make sense to me. So, for example, when the scabs/humans captured Jack and Julia, and then Jack wouldn't reprogram the drone, they let them go. Why would they do that? Now that they know about them, if this guy works for the aliens, he's been programmed by the aliens, why let him go? And I think a single line of dialogue, I know Morgan Freeman's character, Malcolm, kind of intuited this, but I think a little additional dialogue saying there, I believe this guy's different. I believe he won't tell them. I think he'll be back. Just something about that faith.
And he gave him didn't he give him some kind of coordinates to go check out, where basically he was going to find another version of himself.
Yeah, go to the radiation field.
Yeah, and then he was going to find, that he wasn't the only one there, and it would wake him up. But you're right. I had the same feeling when they let him go, and I had to justify it to myself.
Yeah.
And I think there was a little bit too much subtlety throughout this movie, right? It's kind of like, that's one example where just say it, like repeat it to us, like we're stupid. Sometimes you have to do that to remind the reader or the viewer what's going on. Just say, go check out that radiation field, right? Like, tell them again, implant that suggestion in, so we as the viewer know, like, okay, this is why he's letting him go, and then have him say to his person, he'll be back, don't worry.
Because in a film
planted the seed or something.
Yeah, because in a film like this, where there is such great immersion in the world building, I'm going to be slightly distracted by something sometimes, by some element of the story, and I may not get that piece of dialogue or that reference. Another thing that was similar to that is, why wouldn't the Tet have control of his chopper thing? I would think they would have control of every single computerized element that they gave their clones. And he should not have been able to fly that thing against their orders. But that's, again,
Yeah.
very simply fixed if he goes in and, like, goes and rewires it, right? Something
Yeah.
simple that then is consistent with the story as we understand it, and that helps promote his character as, versatile and problem solving. And then I don't sit there thinking, why aren't they just shutting that thing down? So it's stuff like that. Finally, I'm going to say this. This is pure opinion on my part, but the pool scene was ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree.
It was just a reason to get a woman naked.
Yeah.
There, I said it. My opinion.
No, I agree. I mean, they're trying to show, I guess, like this bond between them or something, but it wasn't necessary.
There was no bond there. He was like explaining, I'm having problems understanding and believing in our mission. And she's like, come watch me get naked.
Yeah, exactly. If they had set that up so that she was clearly manipulating him on behalf of the aliens, right? And this was her way of pulling him out of his mindset, then that would have made more sense. But they didn't set it up that way.
Or if she had a point of dialogue where she was supportive of him, the difficulties that he was going through, and he acknowledged, they had a connection because of that support, and then go off to the pool. Yeah, it was just, but I still think having a pool in your floating house on a planet where they're trying to suck the water dry, it just seemed ridiculous to me.
Right. This is another small thing. I mean, this is kind of a standard sci-fi trope, I guess, which often seems kind of silly. Like you have this Tet, right, which is controlling what's going on and sending out these drones and all this. And then the Tet blows up. Okay, that's fine. And then all the drones just die. But like, aren't those things like autonomous? I mean, they fly around and they do stuff and they analyze stuff. Like, why would they just shut off? Like, why would the programming be, if you lose connection with me, then just fall to the earth? Does it make sense?
Yeah, I agree. So did you pull any themes from Oblivion?
Oh, this is a good one. Because I definitely want to hear what you have to say about this. I was struggling with this one. Thought of a couple things, but they didn't feel like they really fit. One of them was based on, his sacrifice at the end. I had this sort of Star Trek 2 theme of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, right? He's sacrificing himself to save his wife and the rest of humanity. So that was one thing. But that seemed almost limited to that particular moment rather than something that was built throughout the story. So it doesn't ring too strongly with me. The other was just a sort of generic, the human spirit is indomitable, because it was, even though they cloned and reprogrammed these people, eventually his humanity came out. And we see with the humans on Earth, they're not giving up this fight. They're trying everything they can to find a way to take this thing out of the sky, and then eventually they do. So those are the two that I had come up with. What about you? Did you have a message or theme in this?
I had the same one you did about the human spirit, triumphing even in adversity. That was pretty much it. There was a little bit of, love overcomes all kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true.
But I would go with the human spirit over adversity one, because that was more threaded throughout.
Yeah.
Is bringing her back flowers, bringing Vika back flowers and picking up a book. And, those were all very human things to do. And so that was the kind of thread that I kind of picked up throughout the whole thing, was just that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I could go with that.
So what do you take away from Oblivion as a writer?
For me, I take away, don't forget the emotion. Make your characters feel so that we as the viewer or the reader will feel. I think you're probably right that they kind of muted his response as sort of a way to show that he'd been reprogrammed by the aliens and was sort of under their control in that sense. But I feel like that was a mistake. I think that was the wrong choice at some point in the story. I think there needed to be a point where he broke and became human and experienced those human emotions. And that point was probably 30-40% of the way in. Whenever that first reveal was, we see him, because we saw kind of like he stands up against the drone to protect the woman who he later realized was his wife. Right, we start to see his humanity there, and like you said with the flower, I think there needed to be a breaking point where it's like he became emotional, so that we were invested in this with the strength of his feelings and his convictions. So don't forget the emotion of the story. That's my takeaway.
That's a good takeaway. And I think that's a paramount takeaway. I think that's the most important one. The second one, I think of slightly less important, is just to make sure your setups are paid off. Answer the questions.
Yep.
People like
that's a good one.
People like science fiction because we like the science fiction. So go ahead and give it to us.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, because we talk about that a lot of times in other stories where they do have the setups and the good payoffs.
Thank you for joining us as we talked about the story told in the movie Oblivion. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters and all our subscribers. We're so grateful for your support and your encouragement. The Stories Told podcast is available on multiple podcast platforms, and we thank you for liking and subscribing or following, depending on where you're listening. It may not be a big deal to you, but it means a lot to us. If you have a favorite book, movie, or TV series you'd like to suggest for the podcast, leave a comment on the YouTube channel, and that link is in the show notes. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com, and those links are also in the show notes. Join us next time as we discuss the story told in the novel Fablehaven. Thanks so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.